Right, here we go. G'day. Welcome back to another episode of GST Junkies. Mr. Eddie, how are you?
G'day, mate. Doing well. I'm currently sitting here in Townsville, getting closer up to where you're supposed to be living, but you're not. But yeah, we're doing well. Um, we just got back from a big spearfishing trip in the Capricorn Bunkers, which was really enjoyable. It's like the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef. Spent 4 days out there on a livable charter and just basically shooting fish and filling up the freezer. That's been good. And currently trying to get back onto my own GST training. Sometimes when you go off road a little bit, you get a bit sidetracked, then you come back, you're like, oh, what was I doing again? It's like, oh yeah, do my handstands, do my training. But but yeah, doing well. How are you going? Because now you're on the other side of the country, aren't you?
Yeah, that's it, mate. Down in South Australia. I was going to say I did a liverboard off in Cairns and thought, yeah, I can still do some handstand training while I'm out in the boat, but it's impossible. Like trying to do a handstand on a ship, it's just not going to happen.
So this was my idea too. I was like, oh yeah, we have to get some really good content. Do some handstands on a boat again, or maybe like on the reef. And didn't even like get close to even thinking about it while out there. It's just it wasn't a good time to be doing handstands.
No, exactly, mate. Exactly. Yeah, I'm down in SA at the moment, so we've just moved into our new house swap, and we're down there until Christmas. So yeah, it's a nice little spot. We're virtually right on the beach. But yeah, it's been a bit rainy today, but yeah, other than that, it's all good. It'll be interesting to see how we go for the next 9 months down here, but we're settling in and getting used to it. But yeah, definitely a change from the humidity and the heat in Queensland. So yeah, we'll
Yeah.
see how we go. But anyway, today we're going to talk about handstands, funnily enough. Not handstands on a boat, but we're going to talk about handstand training and specifically adult only handstand training. And the reason behind that is because obviously Erdy and I both coach a lot of adults with their gymnastic skills, and handstands is a big part of that. So we thought we'd dive deep into that. And as we only teach adults, we don't really teach kids, but there's definitely a big difference, I think, between coaching kids and coaching adults. In your experience, Mr. Erdy, what do you think are some of the main differences with adults who want to learn handstands in comparison to maybe kids?
In my limited experience of never having trained a kid to handstand, I'm probably gonna say there's probably a few differences. I think there's probably some which I'm a bit unaware of in regards to, I think focus is the big one. I don't understand how adults get kids to do anything. Like how does someone get a child to handstand when like they can barely teach their child to like, tie their own shoelaces? Or maybe that's just me as a kid not really being very smart and knowing how to tie my shoelaces. But I imagine that would be the one of the biggest struggles is like how do you get this kid to focus? But
Mm.
then they also must have a lot of pros going for them because there are, lots of little gymnastic kids running around doing handstands and shoulder presses. Like you've seen like little 5-year-old girls doing shoulder presses for reps and, here as adults like struggling to do a press the handstand. It's quite funny. And obviously the pros there will be, they're much shorter, they're much lighter, they're much more strength to like weight ratio goes in their favor. And then I guess if their parents are just taking them to gymnastics classes 4 to 5 days a week, they've got no choice but to be consistent.
Mm.
Whereas as an adult, you can kind of bunk off your sessions if you don't really fancy it. Whereas a kid is like, oh no, gotta go gymnastics again. Mum and dad need their me time at home, so I gotta go and do my shoulder presses at the gym. You got no choice. But
Yeah, that's it. I think time's a big part of it. Kids, like you say, when they've got scheduled sort of classes where they're learning to do their gymnastic stuff, and how often do you see kids just playing with handstands, like
yeah,
cartwheels and stuff like that in the park? So, the exposure, the consistency is a big part of it.
yeah,
But yeah, I think that's a good thing. The strength to weight ratio, like you say, their relative strength in comparison to most adults is definitely in their favor. But I think
yeah,
big things like I can sort of see as well. I think like kids are generally more flexible. As adults, we spend a lot more time sitting in a chair, sitting at work, getting tight through our shoulders. So we lack a lot of flexibility that kids have. And the other one I think is probably fear. As a kid, you're just not afraid of pain. Like you just seem about to fall over and just bounce back up and go again, or you have a bit of a cry and then you get back to it. Whereas I think as we get older, as adults, we sort of, I don't really want to fall over and hurt myself, or I don't really want to sprain my wrist or hurt my shoulder. So we have this big fear that I feel that, a lot of us have to overcome in the handstand. So I think
yeah,
they're the main differences. I also think we have a fear of failure. Like as adults, you know, I don't know whether it's our culture or what it is, but we're always just striving to be successful. Whereas I think sometimes kids just don't, they want to be successful, but they just don't care as much. I mean, they're not afraid to fail and bounce back up. But as we get older, it's like, I can't fail at something, or I've always got to be successful. And if something's too hard, I'm just going to give up, because I prefer to give up and not try than to fail. So I think being able to let go of expectations for adults when you're learning something like handstands can be a big part of it. But yeah, it's a tricky thing, isn't it, to commit
Yeah.
to the journey of handstand training?
Yeah, 100%. I think the fear of failure is actually probably, yeah, a lot bigger than we realize. Always see it with handstands, or I'll see it with people submitting their videos of their online coaching for their handstands, and they'll do this like this prep, this like mental prep before every set or every rep, where they're like twiddling their thumbs and toes and like looking at the floor and doing this or that, and it's because they want to not fail this set. Whereas it just ends up holding them back. It's like all this time being spent on this preparation instead of just getting on their hands and worrying about falling over. And then like as a kid where you're a lot shorter as well, if you do fall over, you're not hurting yourself. Whereas, you're like a 6'5" guy, or I mean, I don't really train many people that are 6'5", but whatever, if you're like over 5 foot and you're falling over, that like you're gonna hurt yourself, and you don't know how to fall anymore because you don't fall anymore. Whereas as a kid, you're falling quite often. So just you fall down, you get back up, you go again. Whereas as an adult, you're like, oh, I'd had this nasty handstand fall the other day, and now I need to take some time off. And it's like, nah, just get better at falling, and it generally fixes the problem.
Yeah.
But no, I
In your
agree.
experience with clients, like what have you found helpful? What do you think helps them overcome that sort of fear?
Having them basically force it has been quite useful. So setting them like an overbalanced target for the session. So it's like, or in their warm-ups, like, okay, you're not allowed to start your handstand drills until you have purposefully fallen forward over your hands. When I say fallen forward, I don't mean like falling on your back. All I mean is like taking your weight far over enough over your hands so that you have to bail out of it forwards instead of bailing out of it backwards. So we refer to that as like overbalance versus underbalance. So it just forcing them to do that, because but basically if you can have the confidence to like kick up into a handstand or even hold a chest to wall handstand, you have enough strength to fall forwards or bail forwards out of a handstand, generally speaking. And if you can do that, then it does help remove that fear element quicker, because then you just start familiarizing yourself with how to fail forwards or how to bail forwards. But it's a lot easier said than done. Like, some people will just be spending months on it and taking their time with it, and it'll take a while. But as soon as you can get over that fear, your handstand journey becomes a lot quicker.
Mm. Yeah, 100%. I agree with you there. You know, a couple of good things you mentioned there is like obviously the wall. The wall's a big benefit, and like learning to handstand on the wall instead of trying to handstand in the middle of the room can give us
Yeah.
that sort of bit of comfort. The wall becomes our best friend. And then we also, like you say, I think the understanding bail, like understanding how to cartwheel or how to, come out of the handstand so that we don't hurt ourselves, building the confidence in that. And whether that's off the wall or, like you say, it's just kicking up and, falling out of the handstand, deliberately falling out of the handstand, or the intention of the drill is not to hold the handstand, it's just to kick up and come back down, kick up and come back down. And over time, that just sort of helps us, get comfortable with the idea of like, okay, I can control this, or if something does go wrong, I can save it, or I can, put my feet back on the ground and not land on my face. So yeah, that's a big part of it. Overcoming the fear.
Yeah, yeah. The fear is a big one for adults. It's true, because you'd always see it as well. Like, I'm sure you saw it a lot in your gym when you were teaching people with handstands and stuff as well. You would get people in like the class who just were too scared to kick up, and those that would just be more than happy to kind of kick up and fall forwards. I think this is usually a good expression of what they've been exposed to as a child or in their younger years. Like maybe some of them have done some gymnastics, maybe some of them they used to do cartwheels. There's some kids who just didn't have that experience and didn't have that exposure. You mentioned cartwheels. I think cartwheels are a nice like preparatory handstand drill to like focus on bailing or how to bail and support yourself on one arm to bail. But you'll see it like the people who are happy to fall and happy to bail and go over their hands will always make quicker progress. And just because they can actually spend more time in the areas that's useful, which is having the weight over their hands in a handstand. Whereas generally the people that were scared to fall would always like underkick a little bit. So they would never fully go to the point where they could even reach the potential to balance. So they would always be spending their time basically on the floor in an underbalance, and you would never learn to handstand.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Time, that's a good topic, mate. I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's a valid point. We can waste a lot of time. I think a lot of adults waste a lot of time when they first start training handstands. And like you say, it's about spending quality time in the handstand. And I suppose it's training efficiently and effectively for handstands. What do you think are some of the biggest mistakes that you see adults making when they decide, okay, I want to learn to handstand?
Basically spending too much of their time making every set about trying to catch balance and like actually handstand when they haven't like broken it down enough. Well, everyone sees it as like just a skill. You just need to practice to get it better, which you do, but you need to practice the areas which you're lacking and which they don't. So, you know, some of them will get it kind of quick because they just happen to only need the area that they're practicing. So I think like in the last call we were talking about, almost engineering it a little bit or having like different segments of the handstands which need to be trained a little bit. We'll go into a bit more detail on that later this call. But yeah, I think that adults just spend too much time trying to only balance when actually they need to learn how to kick, they need to learn how to stack, they need to learn how to balance in both directions using their hands, using their palms, using their shoulders. And they just need to learn how to push and how to like be strong in where they're trying to balance as well. And then if they need flexibility, they need to get more flexible too. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I like that because my answer was I think they strive for balance. Like we see the handstand and we think, oh, it's just a question of balance. I just got to
Yeah.
balance on my hands. So, like you say, they're kicking up the handstand or they're putting every set into, okay, just kick and balance, just kick and balance. But they overlook the foundations of what actually gives me balance. And it's the strength, like you say, it's the understanding of the kick up, the force that we need to, stack our joints, and it's the flexibility. And if we lack the strength, we lack the flexibility, or we lack this awareness of what makes us balance, then like a lot of time can be wasted just trying to get the balance result without building the foundations or putting the steps in place that are going to make balance easier. Yeah, so I agree with what you're sort of saying there. I
Same.
also believe there's this focus, like you say, kids don't focus, but I really think sometimes adults we just see, okay, I've got to do 5 sets of 30-second reps or whatever it is. They're just like, they're so focused on the reps and sets, but they're not actually focused on, okay, what am I trying to accomplish here? Like, what's the point of this exercise? And also just being able to review, like video yourself doing the exercise and then thinking about, okay, where is my alignment, or why did I fail, or what did I fall out of that handstand, or what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? What's the next thing that I can focus on? And a lot of times it's just like, get the work done, tick the box. I've done the work. Why can't I handstand? And it's like, well, actually it requires a lot more focus than that. You've got to actually have this awareness of like, where the weight is, the weight shifts, understanding overbalance, underbalance, understanding PPT, understanding open shoulders, understanding all these terms that we talk about, when we're doing handstands. But then also building an awareness of yourself and being able to coach yourself. Because I think even when you're working with a coach, like I can't learn to handstand online. I've got to have a coach there to correct me. Yeah, the tactile feedback's awesome. But at the end of the day, if you're aware of your own body and you know what these things are and you've got the focus to be able to control this sort of stuff, then you're your best coach. Like you can correct yourself and know what that feels like. But yeah, I feel like handstands is a very mindful practice. It's nearly a meditative practice, I find. And you've sort of really got to have this sense of awareness about what you're trying to accomplish and, how the pieces stack together. What have you found in your own handstand journey, or what do you think were some of the best, I suppose, focal points or changes that, led to your success?
Yeah. I definitely see what you're saying there with the focus on the adults, especially the box stickers. I've met a lot of them. It's like, hey, look, this isn't just about doing the sets and reps. It's like you've got to fucking tune into those sets and reps. You got to feel what those sets and reps and what is it you're trying to do with it. My biggest help was I think just videoing myself more and videoing every single set and rep, and then starting to analyze, okay, why did this set work and why didn't this one work? You know, why am I falling here and I'm not falling here? Why was this one harder and why was this one easier? And the only way I could do that was by videoing pretty much every single set that I was doing, every single rep that I was doing. Even now, like, okay, I won't video a lot of my warm-up sets, but I'll still video the majority of my working sets because it's quite hard to develop the mind muscle map. I think Mikael Christiansen, he was the first guy I heard this from. It was like it was the mind map of the handstand. So like when you're standing, you've seen yourself standing, whether in a mirror or you felt yourself standing for so long now, you kind of know where everything is. Like if you shift your hips forward, you can feel the weight shifting your toes. If you pull your hips back, you can feel it move onto your heels and that you're going to fall backwards, etc. In a handstand, you don't really know where everything is because you've kind of inverted and now you've got a different sensation point on the floor, which is your hands, which you're not used to, or most people aren't used to. And now you've got to figure out that map all over again. And so it's inverted. It's a different points of contact, and it's also different muscle groups which are doing most of the work. When you're standing, it's your hips. Or when you're handstanding, it's your shoulders. So now you got to like rebuild this mind map all over again. And it's really hard to do that if you don't have video. I think like we were saying about the kids, when kids learn to handstand or when you learn to handstand in person, you've got a coach there kind of screaming at you. I say screaming, but you know, basically telling you what you should be doing and where you are. Whereas if you're training by yourself, you don't have that. So you need, like you said, exactly as you said, you need to be your own coach, right? Otherwise, it's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the idea of like the curiosity. You're asking questions and it's like, why did this handstand feel better? Why did I fall out of that one? And I think that's the sort of mindset that we have to have when we're learning skills. It's that curiosity of like, okay, that didn't work, but what can I try next? Or, hey, that worked. What did I do? What did I write? You know, and just being constantly curious. I also find, and it's funny, I've had conversations with clients about this and other people I've trained with too, is like the handstand, you seem to take 1 or 2 steps forward and then you take a couple of steps backwards. It's like every time you learn, like, okay, all of a sudden I learn to open the shoulders and it just changes the whole thing. Like you said, it's that body map. All of a sudden my shoulders are now open, but now the rest of my body is out of alignment because I'm so used to having the body in a different position. But now the shoulders are open. I've got to correct everything else. It's like, oh, hang on, where am I? And it's just like stepping forward and then, oh, hang on, step back, correct this, step forward, step back. So it's like, it can be very slow progress, but the curiosity definitely helps. And I think also with skill development, like research shows that it's really good for us to visualize and have that visual sort of feedback. So like a lot of professional athletes will visualize, you know, their game, their match, their sport, their sprint, whatever it is they're doing before they actually go and compete. And this visualization can help them improve their performance. And like you say, when you're looking back at the video, you now have this visual sort of feedback of where you are, what's going on, and how to correct that. So then when you're in the actual handstand, you can sort of start to correlate, okay, that's where I am. Now I need to open the hip or I need to open the shoulder. And we get that visual feedback. Whereas when you have a coach, you don't get that. You get the tactile feedback because the coach is there giving you that feedback, but they don't often video you and give you the ability to see yourself. So I think there are advantages definitely from video that we might not get from hands-on coaching. And if you stay curious about that and you really sort of, you know, use those tools to your advantage, then like you say, I think you can progress a lot faster with the handstand than if you're just doing the sets and reps and ticking the box and not really building this awareness of, you know, how to learn to handstand or how to, you know, control your body weight and balance on your hands.
Yeah, I agreed there. Like getting people to feel more curious and develop that practice of curiosity can be a big game changer for adults. So I've had to, you know, what you were saying about helping people figure out why things are going wrong, why they're going right. Very often you'll get somebody send you a video and be like, hey, can you tell me why I fell out this handstand? And I just have to turn the question back on them and be like, well, no, why don't you tell me why you fell out this handstand? And then now they have to analyze it and they have to engineer it themselves. Obviously, you'll be there to help them, and help them figure it out. Don't not answer the question, but you know, getting someone to start questioning it themselves instead of relying on you to answer it for them will then in turn make them question all of their sets when they're doing their handstands instead of just every now and then sending you a question with a video.
Yeah, you don't want to spoon feed them, mate. They've got to grow
Yeah,
up.
exactly.
Aren't you adults? What are you doing?
There is, yeah, exactly. There is this fine line with it, isn't there, between like the coaching, like actually being a coach and answering questions and getting someone to coach themselves. Because you need an element of both.
Yeah, I think a big part. I think that's one of the things I've really seen with the online coaching. Like when I used to coach clients more face to face, they become very dependent on the coach. Like they rely on the coach to tell them what to do and correct their bad form. And if they're having a bad day and they're not focused, it's okay. The coach will look after me. Whereas when it's online, and it's all of a sudden now they're in charge of their own training. Then it's a big responsibility for them to take that on. But I find that if they're willing to take that on, and if they're willing to train by themselves and be very mindful about their own training, that they progress a hell of a lot faster. I think it's definitely a skill that, everyone should learn, like the ability to coach yourself, the ability to write your own program, the ability to see, how to make progress, like having that understanding, like it accelerates learning. It accelerates progress with everything, strength development, weight loss, skill. So I've actually found that I think a lot of my online clients make better progress than, back in the day when I was doing more face to face.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm never too sure if it's like, is it because of the methods of online coaching or is it because of the people the online coaching attract? But then saying that, you actually had a lot of people that you trained in person move to your online coaching, didn't you? So you would have seen that actually these people who I was training online, now they're training, these people I was training in person, now I'm training them online. You can kind of see them evolve in a different way. Whereas I never fully got that experience. For me, it was most people that basically trained with me online never really had any in-person coaches. But yeah, I see what you're saying there.
Yeah, it definitely changed. Like the people that I was working with just face to face. Initially, I couldn't train everybody face to face because I owned a gym, or I couldn't give people 2-3 sessions a week. So it was like, okay, I can train you once, and then I can write you a program to do by yourself the other couple of times a week, just because I don't have the time. So they were sort of forced to take it on that way. So it was sort of like combining face to face and online at the same time. And then obviously it got to the point where I left the gym and left the country. So I was like, well, you can either train with me online 100%, or you're going to have to find another coach. But it just sort of rolled out that way. But yeah, I did find that when I gave the client more ownership and more responsibility, that the ones that stepped up to that definitely progressed a lot faster than clients who need to have their hands held. But it's each for their own. Some people just need that accountability and need to work with a coach, and there's nothing wrong with that. I totally get it.
No, definitely.
Online training is not for everyone, but at the same time, I think the people that have got that ability, can progress a lot faster.
I think with the handstands, if you don't have ownership of you wanting to achieve the handstand, it's going to be almost impossible to achieve it unless you're working with someone in person very frequently, and they're just like forcing you into the position and getting to stay there. But otherwise, if you're not working with someone online for handstand, in person for handstands, yeah, it's going to be impossible to get it unless you have ownership.
Yeah, exactly. That leads nicely to the next question, mate. Can I get my handstand in 30 days? How long is it going to take me to get my handstand?
You can definitely get it in 30 days if you can already do one. Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one, isn't it? No, I mean, generally speaking, people like no one achieves a handstand in 30 days. Like kind of what we were saying before, sometimes depending on past experiences that the person's had, and if they've got all the right characteristics, they will definitely learn it faster than someone who hasn't. But I've never really seen someone go from like 0 to hero in 30 days for a handstand. If this is basically someone who hasn't been able to balance, then be able to start balancing in 30 days. I've seen some like impressive results in 30 days, but impressive results basically means, let's say you've just been introduced to the heel pull drill. So when you like kick up against the wall, your heels are on the wall, and then you press your fingers into the floor to like pull yourself off the wall. So I've seen, people go from having no idea what that drill was to then in 30 days be able to pull off the wall and hold for like 5 to 6 seconds or so. But that's like the extent of what impressive progress in 30 days would look like, as opposed to going from not being able to handstand to being able to handstand. So yeah, how long will it take? Fuck, I don't know. It might take you 3 months to start getting your first floats. It might take you 6 months. I've seen some people take longer, but usually the people who it takes longer with are the ones who are afraid to fail or afraid to fall over, like we were talking about before, because they are so scared of falling and failing. They will literally set back their practice like a year up to 2 years, if not more, just because they're not getting the time that they need over their hands because everything they do is in underbalance. Yeah. What about yourself? Like, what's the quickest you've seen someone go from nothing to handstand?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think, you sort of mentioned characteristics there, like the characteristics of the handstand. If you've got the characteristics, then you'll progress faster. I think that's mainly flexibility and strength. Is that what you're saying is
Oh
good
yes.
characteristics?
Sorry, yeah, the flexibility, strength, so. It's more so like the mental ones that we spoke about, the fear of the failing, the taking ownership of your practice, being curious about your sets, the things that we've mentioned. Because sometimes you'll get someone and they've ticked all the boxes for those things in terms of, oh yeah, I can see this person's going to learn to handstand fast. Like they're analyzing their sets. They're not asking me why they're falling on like every single set, but they're actually making an effort to learn about the differences between different sets. And they're not scared of falling. Like they're showing me themselves like kicking up and bailing forwards. Okay, they've got the characteristics. They're gonna learn fast.
Yeah, exactly. And that, it's like, how long's a piece of string? Like,
Yep.
we talk about like handstand training isn't just ticking the box. It's the mindfulness of the practice. And I find that if the person is very mindful and you can start to talk to them about, okay, where are you feeling the weight under your hands? Can you shift the weight to the middle of your hands, to your fingers? Do you understand the heel pull, the toe pull, all this sort of stuff? And if they're very mindful and they start to take ownership, then they're obviously going to progress a lot faster. 6 to 12 months, they could start holding, a good sort of 30-second freestanding handstand. But for those that are not mindful, those that are ticking the box, like 12 months, 2 years, like they've got to learn to slow down, learn to be patient, learn to just build that awareness. And then it also comes back to frequency and also number of goals. So, some people want to train the handstand, but they only want to train it 2-3 times a week. And okay, that's okay. You can make progress with that, but it's going to be a lot slower than the person that comes and wants to train handstand 4 or 5 times a week. They're going to progress a lot faster. So consistency and frequency are a big part of it. I also think a common problem we have in calisthenics, gymnastics, bodyweight training is that list of goals. There's 100 things I want to do and I'm trying to train it all at once. So if we're very particular about, okay, I want to learn to handstand and maybe I've got 2 or 3 other goals around that, those people will progress a lot faster with their handstand than the people that are trying to train 10, 15, so many different goals at once. So it's like, how long is it going to take me to learn to handstand? Well, my answer is that depends. There's a whole list of things going on, but
Yeah.
it really comes back to the individual. If the handstands are a priority for you, like if that's a goal that's really high on your list, then you've got to make sacrifices. What goals are you willing to drop? How much can you focus on the handstand? And then you're going to start to progress a lot faster. It's sort of what I tell my clients. And, sometimes they're not willing to drop their big list of goals. So it's like, okay, if you're only training handstands twice a week, well, it's going to be a slow journey. It's going to take,
Yeah.
12 months, 2 years probably before you start to get to that certain level. Yeah.
Yeah. I have noticed that handstands can be quite sensitive to mental space and mental resources. So some of the quickest results I've had are from people that haven't had or didn't have many responsibilities in their life in terms of either job or relationships or yeah, anything like heavy demanded of them. So they could afford to have more mental resources spent on the handstand. I mean, generally speaking, it also meant that they could practice a little bit more, etc. But like mentally speaking, they just had a lot less stress going on and a lot less to think about, and they could spent more of their thoughts on the handstand, analyzing their handstand, looking at their videos, thinking about them, and just having more clarity and focus in their sessions. Whereas I know myself, when I've gone through like more stressful periods of time in my life, even though I would keep my handstand training relatively consistent in terms of frequency, I just couldn't figure things out as well, or I just wasn't really there in my sets. You know, like I couldn't feel the same connections as I could when I was like less stressed because my head's all over the place or distracted somewhere else. And you need to be like present with those handstands. So yeah, I find that can definitely make a difference too.
Yeah. Mate, I was just about to say that's why you progressed with your handstand so much faster than I did.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you're trying to tell me that. Nah, I'm
I-
too stressed, mate.
yeah, I had no responsibilities.
Yeah, that's it. What are your responsibilities again?
Yeah, yeah. Every time if somebody's making better progress than you, just always bring that back to them. You're like, yeah,
Oh dear. Yeah, I love it, mate. I love it. It's good.
yeah,
Yeah, well, I want to get more into the idea of training and we'll talk about some of the training stuff. But before we get into that, I think it's a good idea. Maybe we talk a little bit about the perfect handstand. I think a lot of times, we people are striving for this perfectly straight
yeah,
alignment of the handstand. We want to get a handstand. And even from a coaching point, sometimes it's like, we fall into this default mindset of aesthetically, yeah, okay, straight handstands pleasing to the eye. And we might be like, oh, open the shoulders and point your toes and,
yeah.
all these little cues that we can try to give to get a straight handstand. But what are your thoughts around that? Do we need to be working or striving for the perfect alignment here?
Yeah. I was having a conversation with a guy recently on Instagram. He's a good friend of mine. And at the moment, his coach has got him doing handstands and working towards the perfect line. And he was putting up a post and he's like, oh, it was a solid handstand. Like it was beautiful line, great handstand hold. And he's like, oh, I still need to tidy it up a little bit. And I messaged him, I'm like, mate, your handstand line's better than mine. It's like, what do you need to tidy up? Well, like, I mean, it's great that you want to get your line tidy and make it clean, but why? Why are you trying to do this? It's it's much better than mine, and I can do a lot more with my handstand than you can do with yours. I mean, I didn't really say it like that. It was less blunt, but basically just trying to get the point across that having his handstand better won't really make much of a difference other than having the handstand line more appealing and more aesthetic. There is, I do believe that like there's a, I'm not saying everyone should go around having a banana handstand, like arched back, legs over their head, things like this. That's not what I'm kind of suggesting. But there is a point of diminishing returns in terms of what you get back out of trying to get a stronger line. Um, and I was listening to, I think it was Emma and Mikhail speak about this on one of their podcasts, and they were saying the straight line handstand has basically been formed from a performance perspective and through basically people paying for shows. Like no one wants to go pay for a show and like see a wobbly handstand. They want to see, people with pointed toes, people looking nice and pretty in their lines, etc. And this is kind of where the straight line handstand developed from, if I understood correctly. But when it comes to functionality of actually your balancing, it's actually quite inefficient. It's really hard to balance a really perfectly straight handstand compared to having one which has got like very slight close in the shoulders and you know a little bit less effort going into it to make it as perfectly straight as possible. It's yeah, it's not easy to hold.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I think it really comes down to like line versus hold time. And we can afford to sacrifice some of the alignment or the line if we can start to increase hold time. Because in the beginning, when you're learning to handstand, it's like, well, the objective is to balance on your hands. And the more time you can spend balancing on your hands, then the more awareness and the more understanding you're going to get of the handstand. So I think we can sacrifice some of the line to, balance on the hands. And then as balance gets better, as the time starts to get a little bit better or a bit more consistent, then we can start to hone in on the line a little bit more and start to make small corrections to bring you closer towards that perfect handstand. But then, like you say, I don't think it's necessarily relevant for us to have the perfectly straight handstand. We can learn to handstand, and then we can learn to start to do tucks and straddles and press and all this sort of stuff without having a perfectly straight handstand. We could waste a lot of time in our training trying to get the perfect handstand that we could be spending on other skills and learning other variations of the handstand, which might even help us progress faster to get to the perfect handstand. But yeah, I think, we can get a bit obsessed about the line sometimes, and maybe that's social media and it's the norms and the aesthetics and stuff that we're after. But it can take away from, I think, the joy and the experience of just being able to balance on your hands. So even though as a coach, I'm obviously trying to coach on building awareness for my clients to move closer to that line, I don't think we have to be very critical on it, or we don't have to see, okay, you've got to get perfectly straight before you can progress, with other handstands. Just let's get time on the hands. Let's understand balance to start off with. And once we get balance, then we can start to correct it, is the mentality I sort of take now with handstands. I used to be more about, okay, got to open the shoulders, got to point the toes, but that's just like, you know what? That doesn't help people. I think it slows down the process even more.
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. Maybe we're just a bit salty, mate, because our lines aren't very good.
Yeah, that's it. We're making
Yeah,
excuses, man.
yeah, exactly. We were just making excuses for being shit handstanders. No, I definitely agree with that. I think I was like that as well. Point the toes, PPT, sort of max hollow body hold for your handstand, etc. But it basically doing everything possible to make it harder for this person to actually balance. And if they were to just be in a slightly more, I don't know, comfortable position so they can increase their balance time.
Yeah, no,
They're,
exactly.
yeah.
Scrap the
If they
perfect handstand, just start to play. That's it. My advice to all the adults out there who want to learn to handstand. But anyway, we'll go from there. Mate, I'm curious, like when you first start working with a client, like a client comes to you and they say they want a handstand, is there an assessment? Like what sort of things do you want to see, or what's the starting point that you go through with a lot of your clients?
Yeah. Can they get into a chest to wall handstand hold with their hands relatively close to the wall? If they can get into a chest to wall handstand hold with their hands close to the wall, let's say like a max distance of one hand's width away, and they can hold there with just their toes on the wall for at least 30 seconds, they are ready to start practicing balance drills against the wall. If they can't do that yet, it's basically a hard grueling phases of conditioning without much focus on balancing. That's like my biggest assessment without looking at flexibility and stuff like that. Generally, the chest wall hold will kind of show you their flexibility too. Because I've had some guys come to me with like let's just say very closed shoulders, quite tight shoulders, but we're still getting them to balance because they want to learn to handstand. They want to learn to balance. Like, okay, we can still make you balance even though your shoulders aren't very open. Okay, it's not very nice. It's not a nice shape and it doesn't feel as great as it will once your shoulders are more open, but I can still get you to balance while we work on your flexibility. But if you can't hold a chest to wall handstand, even if you've got the most open shoulders possible, I can't get you to start learning how to balance because you've got nothing you don't have a structure to balance with. So that's my number one biggest thing. That will determine whether or not they're ready to start training handstands or whether or not they have to just start getting stronger.
What would that look like? Like if I come to you and I can't hold that chest to wall handstand for 30 seconds, what sort of things would you work on with a client to be able to build up to that capacity?
Yeah. So now we basically I bring it down to, all right, they just need overall conditioning for wrists, for elbows, for shoulders, upper back, like traps kind of thing. And I would, depend on how far off they are from that chest to wall hold, I would basically just make them do more chest to wall attempts. So we've got things like chest to wall walks where you kind of walk up the wall into a chest to wall hold and then walk back down. This is a really big one. And then we have L handstands or feet elevated handstands off of a box. So it's like hands on the floor, feet on the box. Because this takes away the fear element of it as well. Sometimes people are kind of just scared to have their feet above their head. So if you put the feet on the box, so it's only their hips that are above the head, it just gets a lot less daunting and allows them to basically spend a bit more time in that position. These people, or if that was the case with you, we wouldn't have you doing that every day, because you got to consider it like strength training almost. We would probably have you on that 2 to 3 times a week at most, where you're just spending time getting stronger in the ligaments and the structures, such as the wrists, elbows, and shoulders, so that you can start supporting yourself.
Yep. Yeah, nice one, mate. Cool. Yeah, we'll go into talking a little bit more about programming further down, later in the episode. But I like the idea of the assessment there. Just it's simple, it's easy, it's something that we can do very quickly with just a wall. And we can already see, is this client ready to start working balance drills, or do they just need to spend more time getting stronger so that they can hold that sort of 30-second, wall facing handstand? Do you do flexibility stuff? So like, obviously you can see, if they're doing that chest to wall, you can obviously see limitations. If the elbows are bent, the shoulder angle's not open, but do you do specific flexibility stuff, or is that enough information for you to go on?
So this is where it's quite interesting. So my handstand assessments have the least amount of assessment needed compared to strength and flex and general flexibility assessments. Like if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to get flexible," they get like I need to see like 20 different videos of like the different planes and things like this. Somebody's coming to me and they say, "Hey, I want a handstand." I need to see, like, top of my head, I think it's like between 3 and 5 things. So number 1 is the chest to wall. Number 2, so basically, if they can't get into a chest to wall hold, I don't really, and I can see that it's not a flexibility issue. I can see that it's because they're just not strong enough to walk up. Nothing else matters at this point. Like, don't get me wrong, if they have a big flexibility deficit, we will work on that, sure. But it is just not important, as important as getting the wrists comfortable on the floor. So chest to wall is like the number 1 big thing for me. But yes, I will test flexibility too. And the way I will test it is the chest wall is one of them. But if we know that if they can't get into the chest wall, then we don't have a true assessment of flexibility. We can't actually see if their shoulders can open or not, because they haven't walked up into the wall. So what I'll do is I'll get them to lie on the floor in a prone position. The hands are above the head with a stick, and then can they lift the stick off the floor? Now this kind of gives me more of a strength at the end range type assessment than their true passive flexibility. But if they can't lift that stick off the floor, then it means, number 1, either they're not strong enough or they're not flexible enough. I need to kind of figure that out with another assessment. And then the other assessment I use is the overhead squat. So it's hands shoulder width, stick above the head, and basically just squat down for me and let me see what that looks like. It doesn't matter if they can't get into a full squat. What matters for me is, can they keep the arms above the head, or can they keep the shoulders open? The reason I use this one is usually because I'm also testing flexibility elements as well. So for that reason, I'm trying to get as much value from specific exercise as possible, so I know how to address the whole person as a whole. But if I wasn't using the overhead squat, then another very simple passive shoulder test you can do is kind of this. Yeah.
The one I use, like I'm similar to you, I do that wall facing handstand. The other one I use is like back to wall. So you're standing, the feet are about maybe 1 foot length away from the wall. So you're leaning it back against the wall. I want you to set PPT. So lower back is flat against the wall. And then we just do arms directly out in front of the body. So arms are straight. You're holding them parallel to the floor in front of the body. And then I want to see you, can you lift your arms up overhead and touch your hands to the wall? And what this allows us to sort of see is, okay, is that pec or lat tightness that's preventing the shoulder from opening? A lot of people will start to do that and they'll get to a point where they can't touch the wall, which shows that the lats are tight. And then if they bend the elbows and they can touch the wall, then it's a potential sign that the pecs are tight. And the only other one I do there back to the wall is, okay, we bring the elbows up to be parallel with the shoulders and they're out to the side, and the elbows are bent at 90 degrees with the hands out in front. And then I want to check external rotation. And can we bring the back of the hands to the wall there? in that externally rotated position. And if not, maybe external rotators are tight as well. So that's probably the flexibility drill that I've used in my assessment. I don't know whether you agree with that or disagree with that, or your thoughts around that.
Yeah. So I use that assessment if someone can't get their shoulders, the hands are above their head, to help figure out what basically the restrictions are for why they can't get their hands above their head. But it's also a slightly more active variation. Like I remember I used to be able to handstand, but I couldn't get my hands on the wall. That makes sense. I could with that setup that you spoke about, back to wall, I couldn't get my wrist to comfortably touch the wall, but I could handstand, and I could even get into a straight handstand in a chest to wall hold. The reason being is because I need more trap strength to lift my arms up and directly over my head than I do when when you're in an actual handstand on the floor. So if you're in a chest to wall handstand, it's actually relatively passive flexibility in open shoulder position. But if you can't get into a chest to wall handstand, let's say I'm still assessing someone, they can't get into a chest to wall handstand, the back to wall drill doesn't show me their their available passive range. What it shows me is their available active range. So I still need to see if they have passive range. And what I should have mentioned earlier is the other assessment I have for passive range is just the hang. So it's like, let me basically get the person to hang, and I get a video side on, and let me just see, are the shoulders open in a passive hang. If they can passive hang with all the shoulders open, then it tells me this is what they have capability for. And then I will, if they can't, let's say if their shoulders aren't opening in the passive hang, then I'll use the back to wall drill to figure out why. It's like, okay, is it pecs? Is it biceps or lats? Or is it rotator cuffs, like you mentioned?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I do think that drill is great, or that assessment is great.
Yeah, it's just a nice one to isolate a little bit more, because we can see that like tight pecs and tight lats and tight biceps and tight rotator cuffs, like the symptoms can be very similar. It's like, okay, you got tight shoulders, but like, well, what do we need to spend the time on or where's the most effective stretching going to be, so that we can start to open up those shoulders? So it can be good. I like the idea of the passive and active sort of testing. Yeah, and I agree. Obviously, in the handstand, we've got that ability to be more passive, because the hands are sort of connected to the floor, and we can create that passive range. Whereas, like, doing the lifting drill, that's an active range. Like, you've got to have the strength to be able to pull yourself into that range. So it might not be a direct carryover, but I think it's still, we want to. Your thoughts maybe, but like I sort of see that we want to be able to get the passive and active range to be pretty close to each other. You don't want to have a big discrepancy between your passive and active range.
Yes, definitely. Don't get me wrong. If somebody can hang with very open shoulders, but they can't lift the stick off the floor, then we have a problem. And it's like, we need you to be able to basically pull that stick up to shoulder height. It won't stop me from teaching them how to handstand, but it means we're also going to be doing a lot of trap strengthening at the same time.
Now, this is good, mate. I think this leads nicely into sort of the next area I wanted to take it. And it's sort of like, when we talk about handstands, we talk a lot about stacking, blocking, whatever you want to call it. And the idea is like, okay, we need to put wrists, elbows, shoulders, hips, knees, and ankles, all the joints into some sort of alignment that we can balance over the point of support, which is our hands. And that translates to a handstand, So I think if we sort of start to break it down a little bit, and we look at each joint and talk maybe a little bit about flexibility and a little bit about strength in that joint, or sometimes some of the common issues we see in adults around, those sort of joints, and training tips that we can offer. So maybe best to start from the ground up. What are your thoughts around wrists with adults? What are sort of common things you see, and what do you do in terms of flexibility and strength around the wrists?
Yeah. So I think wrists people try to make the wrists a bit more complicated than they need to be. I think, wasn't it in one of your FRC courses that the guy was like trying to get people into like basically a full like wrist extension? When I say full, like a 90-degree wrist extension. So if you put your arm out straight and then you lift your knuckles up towards your head, can you get your wrists up to 90 degrees? And I think a lot of people will try to suggest that if you can't, then it means you shouldn't be trying to handstand, or you shouldn't be trying to put your hands on the floor. things like this. But I don't think it's that simple or has to be like that.
I'm in trouble.
Yeah, you're in trouble. Exactly. Because I remember you didn't have it. You couldn't,
No, I
you
still
didn't
don't
have
have
90,
it.
you still don't have 90-degree wrist extension, but you can still handstand, right?
Yeah.
So I have a generic wrist warm up that I use for everyone. So it's like a 5 to 7 minute routine of hands on the floor. So you stretch the wrist in different positions, and then you load the wrist in different positions, and then you load the back of the wrist, and you kind of put a bit of weight into your knuckles and load the knuckles, etc. I give this to everyone to do, and it's something that I do myself as well before every session. Sometimes it will only be 2 minutes. Sometimes I'll do a longer one. It's be like 5 minutes. Sometimes just 30 seconds. But that is the extent I go to at the wrists. Now, I will only give somebody more wrist work if they actually have issues with their overhead flexibility and issues with the wrist extension. And the reason is because of, I kind of learned this from Emmett, but he spoke about the concept of chains. So let's say one that people understand very easily. Let's say you're trying to touch your toes. You fold down and you can touch your toes comfortably, but then when you elevate the foot slightly, like the toes. So you basically bring yourself into more dorsiflexion, and then you try and touch the toes again. It gets a lot harder. It's quite similar with the wrist and the shoulders. So sometimes if you're trying to open the shoulders to 180 degrees, if your forearms are struggling to open up enough, it can also impact the shoulder flexion, or it basically takes away some of the slack. I know it sounds a bit weird, but supposedly that is how it kind of works. So if you're trying to get someone to a full 180 degrees opening their shoulders, if you also give them some extra room in the wrist, so let's say if you just improve the wrist flexibility, so the forearm flexibility, it can help provide a little bit more slack for the shoulders, which can then help them get access that a bit easier. So that's the only. This is assuming somebody that nobody has wrist pain. I don't give them anything more specific to the wrist other than my 3 to 5 minute warm up. Yeah, if they don't have any overhead flexibility and they don't have any wrist flexibility, then I will kind of give them a bit more.
Yeah, I agree, mate. I think there's a lot of wrist warm-ups out there and a lot we can do. And I'm the same as you. Some days my wrists feel tighter, so I'll spend longer warming up the wrist, and other days they feel good. So like say it might be just 30 seconds, it might be quick, and I just go into it. I've got a good understanding of where the wrists need to be before, I start my handstand training. And I think most of the wrist stuff is taken care of in the actual training of the handstand. Like you don't have to be too specific on a heap of wrist stuff to be able to get good results in terms of strengthening and flexibility in the wrists. The only thing I would say is I think wrists are a very common injury in handstands. When I first started kicking up to handstand or practicing with handstand, I got a wrist injury. And I think that comes back to just the volume and the frequency of training a fair bit. Like when we first start training handstand, we're like, oh, we're excited, we want to handstand, and all of a sudden we're kicking up and we're doing wall drills and we're doing all this stuff and we're applying a lot of weight to our wrists. And we really haven't applied that weight to our wrists before. So you've gone from not much weight on your wrist to now applying your body weight on your wrists at a higher frequency. And it quickly leads to wrist pain. So my only caveat would be like, if you're first learning to handstand and you haven't spent a lot of time on your wrist, it's like just gradually building that up, not racing into 5 sets of 60-second holds like on the wall and stuff like that, because I think that's just a recipe for disaster. And it's just got to be slow progress with the wrist. So you'd be better off doing maybe 3 sets of 30 seconds and doing that multiple times a week, and then building that up to 3 sets of 40 and 3 sets of 50, or, maybe it's 4 sets of 30. There's different ways to progress it, but I just think we've got to be patient and progress that slowly in the beginning. Would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, 100%. This is a lesson that I learned the hard way. Not with myself. I've always been relatively blessed with my wrists, touch wood. I'm the type of person that will kind of just be able to kick up into a handstand with no issues without warming up if I want to. But it was with my online coaching. It was when I was still quite new to teaching handstands. And I had a guy come to me for handstand training. And he's like, hey, I don't train any handstands, but I want to learn to handstand. I'm like, cool. So I just put him on. I think it was 3 or 4 times a week straight away. these handstand sessions, and like by the end of the first phase, he was like, "Hey man, my wrists are broken. I mean, not broken, but like I'm in pain." I'm like, "Oh shit, okay, we should have built this up slower." And that was, that was a my bad kind of event, but this is what happens when we in the learning process. You're gonna learn one way or the other.
Yeah.
When you're working with lots of different people, it's just how it is. So if somebody's not used to loading their wrists on the floor, they need to build that up slower.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Elbows. What are your thoughts around elbows and handstands?
Oh, elbows are a pain, aren't they? They just say, like, I don't want to get, we could go into a whole podcast on elbows specifically. If someone can straighten their elbows, I don't look at them anymore. That's enough for me. It's like if you can get up into a chest of the handstand and you can straighten your elbows, cool. I'm
Yeah.
happy. Your elbows are happy. I'm not giving you any elbow work or anything like that. Because like you were saying with the wrists, the handstands the handstands load the wrists enough. They also load the elbows enough. Like you don't really need to do any accessory elbow work. But you'll get certain situations with adults where they cannot straighten those elbows. And you now need to engineer why and figure out, okay, is it just because the handstand's heavy that they just need to push harder into the elbows and kind of get that stronger? Is it because it's one of the issues that you were talking about earlier with either the rotator cuffs, lats, or pecs? Is it an internal or external rotation issue? Is the scapula not gliding around the rib cage properly and then giving them the room to rotate at the humerus so they can then lock out at the elbow? Like it gets a bit more complicated if somebody can't bend their elbows, and I don't think I can go into it properly, or at least not from my perspective. Maybe you've got maybe a more simplified
Yeah.
approach to elbows.
I wish I could remember the name of this strength coach, but there was a strength coach that I followed a few years ago, and he separated the joints into what he called mobile joints or mobility joints and stability joints. So, like the wrist is a mobility joint; it's a very mobile joint. It can move in lots of different directions. The elbow is just a stability joint. It really doesn't have. It can flex and it can extend. Yeah, there's a tiny little bit of rotation in there, but it's designed to flex and extend. The shoulder is a mobility joint. So we stack. We go mobility, stability, mobility. And the elbow's in between. But generally, if there's an issue with the elbow, like the elbow being bent, the issue is either up the chain or down the chain. The mobility is lacking in the wrist or the mobility is lacking in the shoulder. And that's why the elbow's bending. We're trying our best. The body loves to adapt. It tries to find a way around it. And when we lack the wrist mobility or the shoulder mobility, the way around it is bend the elbow. Then I can get my hands above my head. So often I just okay, if the elbow's bending, the issue is either the wrist is not flexible enough or the shoulder's not flexible enough. I'm looking up and down the chain. So that's mainly my go-to. The only other time I suppose I consider as the elbow is the hyperextension. Have you ever trained clients that have got hyper mobility through the elbow? And what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, they always progress really fast in handstands. I don't know what it is, but hypermobile elbows in handstands are just beautiful. I've seen guys, not people I trained, but like guys go to one arm handstand in like 6 months, and then you look at the elbow joint and it's just beautifully hyperextended. I never tell someone to basically not go into their max range on elbows, but also I haven't really met anyone who has like what I would deem a dangerous or a
Yeah.
whatever level of hyperextension in the elbows. And maybe I've been lucky on that front with my coaching. Generally speaking, if somebody is not in pain in their elbows, I don't get them to change anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree. If it doesn't cause you pain, then don't worry about it. And I think, like you say, a hypermobile elbow can actually help in the handstand, I believe. So, and if there is pain, it's just like, well, bicep curls, your favorite, mate. I just like, you just got to do some more curls, make those tendons stronger so that they can handle, that extra range that you're lucky to have if you've got hypermobile elbows.
Easy, just bicep curls and spinach and you'll be fine.
You're on it. Let's move into the shoulders, mate. What are your thoughts around shoulders?
All right, shoulders. So my thoughts on shoulders on things that we haven't covered yet. You mean like in regards to just generally prepping them for handstands or?
Well, just like I suppose that like we talk about flexibility and strength, yeah, and we've talked
Yeah,
about testing and assessing the shoulders maybe, but like,
yeah,
and you gave some good cues like, okay, if you're not strong enough to hold a 30-second wall facing handstand, then potentially there's a bit of work you've got to do in terms of your shoulders. That
yeah,
pike handstand, feet on the box is a good one. Just doing wall walks and spending shorter amounts of time in the wall facing handstand, good one for strength. The prone, stick lift that you talked about, another good one for building strength in the shoulders. I think there's two things. We're lacking strength in the shoulders or we're lacking flexibility in the shoulders. Is there any more drills or suggestions you'd like to add around, strengthening the shoulders or improving flexibility that you find common with a lot of your adult clients?
yeah. So I basically try and minimize my programs as much as possible in my training so that the handstands themselves will cover everything that we need to cover. So if somebody's weak in the shoulders, and okay, this is another thing. It's like when we say weak in the shoulders, like what do we mean? Do we mean they're just weak at supporting that person upside down? Are they weak at actually pulling into flexion? Because we've got two different things here. Are they weak at like elevating? Again, like that's another separate thing to flexion. Elevation and flexion will require like two separate muscle actions from muscles in the shoulders. So I think this is where sometimes how you said earlier yeah, you were just saying about the shoulders basically encompassing what different segments. So if somebody says, "Oh, my shoulders are weak," well, what does that mean? It's the same way as like if somebody goes to the doctor and says, "Hey, I have a stomach issue," and the doctor says, "Hey, you've got IBS." It's this exact same diagnosis with like frozen shoulder. Somebody says, "Oh, I've got my shoulder doesn't move in this direction," so the doctor's like, "Oh, you have frozen shoulder," but frozen shoulder could be like many different things. We don't really know. Somebody says my hips are tight. Again, it could be many different things. So it's the same with the shoulders. Again, we can get into a lot of this. So the things that I like to get stronger are elevation.
Mm.
Best way of doing this is basically getting someone to push into an elevated handstand in their shoulders or just making them do like upside down shrugs. So imagine you got your arms up above your head and you're pushing the hands to the ceiling and then you're pulling the shoulders down away from the ears. So if you think of the action between the shoulder and the ear, shoulder goes up to ear, shoulder comes down from the ear. When you're doing that in a handstand, when you're pushing the shoulder up to the ear, we're using the upper traps and we're kind of getting stronger in elevation. This is important because it then allows us to open the shoulders more later, but it also allows us to do things like tucks, pikes, press handstands too. Then we have the action of shoulder flexion. So shoulder flexion is somewhere where I will sometimes use weights if the handstands aren't enough. Shoulder flexion will get stronger by making someone do tuck handstands. Basically, as soon as you bring, or any variation that involves bringing weight into underbalance, as soon as a person starts to load underbalance in a handstand, they will start to improve the strength in the flexion and actively flexing their shoulders. If that's not enough for the person, or let's say somebody isn't ready to do any tuck handstands, but you can tell they have weak shoulder flexion because they can't lift the stick off the floor. Okay, now we need to use some weights. We need to do things like trap-free raises, or we need to do things like trying to lift that stick off the floor, etc.
Mm.
So shoulder elevation, shoulder flexion are the two main like strengthening points that I use.
Mm.
And then rotator cuffs. This is something I've been trying to play with a bit more recently. And it kind of depends. Again, this one's quite individual. I've had people who I've never had to touch the rotator cuffs and they've just been fine. They've been able to handstand, developing their handstands, no problem whatsoever. And then I'm having some people who aren't in that position and we've been needing to do extra rotator cuff work for them because they just genuinely aren't able to keep their arms like you don't need like a full maximum external rotation at the top, but the bending of the elbow can sometimes be a sign of this. When the elbow starts to bend sometimes at the top, and it could be a weakness of the rotator cuffs, by getting someone stronger in their rotators, I've noticed it makes it a lot easier for them to support their weight over their head and to stabilize better over their head or mobilize from the shoulder, like you were saying.
Mm. Yeah,
They're my
yeah, yeah,
general three I go to: elevation,
yeah.
flexion, and rotation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's all that upper back stuff, isn't it? Like we need to have a strong sort of upper/mid back to be able to keep the hands in that open position. And like a lot of the stability comes from, the shoulder in the handstand. So if you're just not strong there, if you can't have elevation, when you can't have deflection, well, then that's the strength that you're going to need to build to improve the chances of being able to balance the handstand. I wonder if like there's a Poliquin percentage effect there. So like if your body weight is X, well, should you be able to externally rotate to be able to do a handstand, So it'd be interesting to see like your clients that, don't need to do the external rotator work. Well, what is their 8RM on an external rotator knee up exercise? And then the clients that can't do that maybe don't have the strength, what is their 8RM on a shoulder external rotator? And is there sort of that magic figure of where you need to be to have enough strength in that rotator cuff to be able to do that?
I've got that on my to-do list. I haven't done it yet.
Yeah,
but
good study for you to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Send us those results of that study once you get it.
Yeah, definitely.
Shoulder flexibility is something we want to talk about. Obviously, we want to have that flexibility. We've touched on a fair bit, so it might be handy here to talk a little bit about thoracic mobility. Like you talked before about the scapula being able to slide over thoracic so that we've got the ability to access shoulder flexion. And obviously, if we have a tight thoracic or stuck in slight flexion, that's going to have an impact. What are your thoughts around, thoracic mobility and the requirements in a handstand?
Okay, so different coaches have quite different perspectives on this, and I've done the research on it, and you don't need thoracic extension for shoulder flexion. As far as all the research suggests, like the thoracic extension is a compensation of lack of shoulder flexion. So sometimes you'll get people who can't reach the 180-degree shoulder flexion, but to help get the same angle, they'll just push into their thoracic extension a little bit and they'll get that range. I don't give any of my handstand only clients any thoracic work unless they're chasing things like the bendy handstands. That's the only, when I say bendy, I mean like the handstands where you're purposefully bending in the upper back, extended in the upper back so you can get your hips way past the shoulders, so you can do things like Mexicans, for example, or every other variation of a Mexican handstand. If you Google Mexican handstand, you'll see what I'm talking about. But yeah, otherwise I don't touch the thoracic. I work with shoulder blades and the muscles for them.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I'd agree, disagree. I'd agree to disagree. Just a little bit. I think as long as you've got a certain level of thoracic mobility, but like from experience, like back at the days of the gym, there was one particular client we had that, is it cathodic when you're quite rounded through your thoracic?
Okay. Yeah.
And like his overhead flexibility, couldn't lift his arms above maybe 45 degrees. And you could spend all day trying to get him to lift his arms up, but there was no chance of him doing that because his thoracic was just so stuck in flexion. So yeah, I think, most adults have probably got enough thoracic flexibility to be able to get into that overhead position. But I still think that, there is a little bit of that needs to be there, or a certain amount of that needs to be there for them to be able to have shoulder flexion.
So this is where I might be able to count myself lucky, where maybe I've never worked with somebody who's kyphotic, because this would make sense. If you have negative thoracic extension, so or thoracic flexion, whatever, and you don't have enough thoracic to just straighten your spine, then we're probably going to if you're either going to need like 185 to 190 degrees of shoulder flexion to compensate for it. I guess it will depend on how much your thoracic's messed up. But messed up, that's not a very nice way of putting it, is it?
This guy just did too much bench and bicep curls, mate.
But yeah, I've never had to improve thoracic flexibility to help a handstand. However, if you're very evidently someone who is like very hunched forward and at the thoracic, not just like shoulder, because shoulders rolling forward isn't always a sign of thoracic extension, right? So it's this. But if you're someone who very evidently can't like straighten at the upper back, then you'll probably need to work on that.
Yeah, that's it. All right, on the clock, let's keep moving. What about hips? Talk to me about hips, buddy.
Yeah, hips. Okay, have you ever seen like people when they I used to have this a lot. When I would handstand and my butt would like hang over, I'd have this, I'd call it like the overhang or the butt overhang. It's like when your hips would kind of like hang over your fingertips,
Mm.
and you could see like it almost looks like the person is piked in a handstand, but it's not. It's like the hips are hanging over. So this can sometimes be from just shoulder positioning and where the person's placing the shoulders, but assuming it's not shoulder flexibility and we've done all the assessments, whatever, it's not shoulder flexibility, that's the problem. It can be a tightness in the anterior chain on the hips. And this was partly my case as well. So I used to have super tight quads, super tight hip flexors, and it would affect my overhead flexibility. And I would end up having to like push. Actually, I used to push into my thoracic flexibility to compensate for the lack of flexibility up in the rest of the chain. And what I had to do was basically a lot of couch stretch. I think there was times where I was doing couch stretch almost daily, just to like try and help relieve some of the tension in my lower body. But then I also had to strengthen the glutes so I could actually open the hip actively, because you need that in a handstand. Now, this is quite niche. Um, there's probably, I don't know, like one in, let's say, like 8 people that I train have this issue. So it's not very often, but there are sometimes cases where I need to get somebody's hips open in the anterior chain. Now, obviously, if you're doing straddle handstands, cool. We need a different, we'd need straddle flexibility. But I'm just talking like just for the general
Yeah.
straight
Yeah.
handstand, like I don't really see anyone that needs direct hip flexibility unless they have that issue where they can't open the hips.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of awareness to be built around the hips. It's quite funny. Like, I don't know about you, but like posterior pelvic tilt and anterior pelvic tilt wasn't something I knew much about until I started doing more gymnastics training. Like we're in traditional strength training, we talk about hinging at the hips. So we're doing a deadlift or an RDL, we hinge at the hips.
Yeah.
We talk about hip flexion, but we never really talked about pelvic tilt and being able to control this tilt. And I think for a lot of adults, they don't really have an awareness of tilting and being able to teach tilting, PPT and APT, just so they understand the difference. And then you put them upside down and then they've got to relearn it again because it's like, well, hang on, where am I now in space? But I think that's a big part of it. And then depending, like you say, on the type of handstand, with a straight handstand, what's the flexibility demands compared to like a tuck or a straddle press, we go into it and understanding that. But then everything around the pelvis, you're talking about tight QLs, you're talking about tight hamstrings, you're talking about tight hip flexors. I think there's a lot of flexibility required in more of the advanced sort of handstands as we start to progress handstands around the hips. And it can be a common thing that we don't really think about that much. We see a handstand, we think, oh, it's a straight line. What sort of hip flexibility do you need in a straight line? But I think the pelvic tilt is sort of the key, and a lot of people don't have the glute contraction strength like yourself, or have the tight anterior hip that prevents a lot of the tilting going on. Do you teach anything specifically around tilting, or how do you get your clients to build that awareness of pelvic tilt?
I don't focus on it unless there's a big deficit. So what I've basically the whole PPT stuff, in my opinion, is very overrated and very overused. Like when I'm doing a handstand, I don't focus on a hard posterior pelvic tilt, and I never really had to. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that you don't need a posterior pelvic tilt, but I think sometimes people try and work on it so hard that they take away what's important from the rest of the handstand, which is the shoulders and the hand positioning. Now, as long as you're not like actively anteriorly tilting, then usually people don't anterior tilt in a handstand. And sometimes what looks like an anterior tilt is actually just that they're not pushing the hips forward enough. So this is a bit about the butt overhang I was talking about, because you have posterior tilt, you have anterior tilt, but then you also have closed hips. And you can kind of do that in both an anterior and a posterior tilt. You can kind of close the hips in both. So it's actually the opening of the hip action which I'm more concerned about than I am the hip tilting, because nobody purposefully anterior tilts, and unless they, I don't know, I don't see it often. put it that way. Not as much as like people try and make it out to be, because online, like I see it, I watch people ask on like handstand forums, say, hey, can you help me out with my handstand? And they're posting a video and they've got what I was talking about earlier, which is the butt overhang. And people underneath write posterior pelvic tilt. You need to PPT more. I'm like, no, this person doesn't need to PPT more. And I know they don't, because I also have this problem if I'm not careful. And I can PPT and have a butt overhang at the same time. And I'll show them videos where I'm in this butt overhang and I'll like actively anterior tilt, actively posterior tilt, so they can see the hip positioning, but the butt is still overhanging. So it's not the hips that's the tilting that's the issue. Anyway, I don't want to discredit from PPT. It's obviously, it has its place, but I don't specialize on it because it's usually not what's important for the way I teach.
Yeah. I think this comes back to what we talked about before. It's, it's that perfect alignment, and it's also like just spending time in balance. Like, where are we focusing here? Is the focus on the perfect alignment and getting dead straight and having every joint stacked perfectly, or is it just spending time on the hands? And you can have that butt wink and still balance, so you can still accumulate time on the hands there. And if we're trying to focus purely on the pelvis there, then are we taking away from the balance time? Are we focusing on the wrong or right thing? Yeah, I'm a fan of teaching a little bit of tilt, because I think we lack it, like adults lack it. And like I said, it's not a common sort of movement, but I think it carries over nicely into a lot of gymnastics. Like if you're going to do push-ups, I think a strong PPT obviously helps us hold a tighter hollow body shape and maintain that shape. On the rings, when we're working on, straight body positions, like it can really help to be able to get a good glute contraction. Glutes and abdominals are opposite muscles. So if we can get a good glute contraction, that helps us build more core, if we like to talk about it that way, but anyway, more core tension. So I think, that's something to be careful of. We see a lot of arching in push-ups. We see a lot of arching in a lot of movements where we could be stronger if we understood the PPT a little bit more. And like I said, I think it comes more with advanced handstands. Like obviously when you're moving into your straddle, and even like in your one arm handstand, you've got an awareness of tilt. Like how to tilt the pelvis to get into a better position for you to stack your joints or to find that balance. Whereas I think a lot of beginners wouldn't be able to understand tilting of the pelvis that happens here.
Yeah. So maybe just because I get people to do a lot of chest wall work, and in the chest wall work, I'll just make sure the hips are kind of over the shoulders. Yeah, and it's no one, basically, I've never come across someone in my assessments where they're actively anteriorly tilting in a chest wall handstand. So I've never actually had to tell them you need to posterior tilt more. All I usually need to tell them is just you need to push the hips closer into the wall.
Yeah.
And as soon as they get that and they understand that, I then teach them how to balance off of the wall while keeping that line. And then generally by the time it comes to them doing a freestanding handstand, they're holding the shape that we need them to hold, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
As for GST stuff, like the strength stuff, I do have an anterior posterior tilt video, which I try and help people understand if I can see that they're really struggling with understanding what their hips are doing. But again, sometimes it's a lack of strength further up the chain, which will cause them to express an anterior tilt, and they're trying to arch into the lower back to compensate. Maybe not because they don't know how to posterior tilt, but maybe just because they're really weak and they're pushing. But you'll know that because you'll see them start the set pretty clean, and then like by rep number 8 or 9, they now have this big arch in their lower back. It's like, is it because they don't know PPT, or is it just because they're weak?
Yeah. No, definitely. There's lots of factors to consider when we look at that. But
yeah,
that's a good one. That's a good one to talk about. I think it's a hot topic, mate. We might have to come back and revisit that.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's go on to the last one, like knees and ankles. What are your thoughts around those final two sort of joints?
Yeah, but for handstands, I don't have any thoughts on them, to be honest. I mean, ankles, it's nice to have them pointed because it looks pretty. And if somebody's struggling, let's say somebody wants a nice toe point and they struggle with pointing their toes, and it's like, okay, cool. Let's get these calves stronger. Let's get the extension through the tibia a bit looser, a bit less tense, so we can have a nicer toe point, and also maybe fix the feet up a little bit. But otherwise, for your regular straight handstand, I don't pay any attention to knees and ankles.
Yeah, no, exactly, mate. It's pretty much aesthetics sort of there. The only thing I would say, and maybe this will lead nicely into the next thing I've got here, is just like some lower body tension. Like we think about not so much the ankles. Like I think ankles are very much just aesthetics, but being able to point the toes, make it look pretty. But the knees, in a sense of like, if the knees are not extended, then we're not creating sort of tension through the quads. And if we're a little bit soft in the lower body, that can sometimes be harder to balance. And the way I refer to this is come back to my bag of sand analogy that I think I've used before. Is like, if you've got a bag of sand, it's not going to balance that great, or it's harder to balance the bag of sand because it wants to move around. But the solid object is a little bit easier to balance the tension through the body. If you've got the tension, then it's easier for us to control that. If the knees are soft, then maybe we're losing a little bit of tension and it could be a little bit harder to find the balance point. We're just moving around a little bit more. So that's the only thing I'd probably add to that. But that leads nicely into the next bit where we talk about like alignment, stacking the joints. And, you know, a lot of coaches will use alignment drills, and we've got like back body line drills and front body line drills and all that sort of stuff. What are your thoughts around those sort of alignment drills, and maybe even a comment on like tension in the body during the handstand?
Yeah. So I've had to focus on tension in the handstand for the lower body only now that I'm training the one arm, and it's for the straddle. It's for having like the tensegrity of the straddle to then like translate back into the upper body, because the more tension I can create in that straddle, basically the less my legs are going to start flailing around, like let's say like ants, like antennas, when I start to try and put my weight onto one arm. Whereas in a two-arm handstand, I've never had to hyper focus tension in my legs. Me personally, and I don't cue it either. Don't get me wrong, if somebody's like legs are all over the place, I'm like, hey, sort that shit out. Like just keep them together. You know, I don't get them to like hyper tense or anything like that. But I tell them you need to keep your legs together, stop messing about. And that's usually like a discipline thing than anything. But with the straddle, if you're going for like big straddles, it's like, okay, cool. Now we need a bit more tension because we're basically trying to actively pull into a flexibility position. And in regards to, yeah, you're saying about like stacking and alignment drills. So yeah, they're
I
another
can
hot
see you
topic.
bubbling away there, mate.
I hate alignment
The
drills.
steam's going to come out in a minute, I can see.
So my first ever workshop, what's his name? I don't even know. Yeah, I'll say his name. I don't really care about him too much anymore. Christopher Sommers, first ever workshop. And this whole fucking workshop was about front body line drill, back body line drill, PPT, APT. It was like all these things. We spent 5 minutes on chest to wall holds. We're supposedly doing like a handstand segment, right? We spent about 5 minutes on chest to wall holds, and the rest of it was like preparing for a chest to wall hold. And it's like, what is going on? Like back then, I didn't know anything. This is literally 10 years ago, 2013. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I need to do all this preparatory stuff, prep. And then I actually learned from real hand balancers, and they were like, you need to do more handstands. Like, you actually need to get into a handstand and it will fix all of your problems. Most of the time. Like, there's always a role and a place for engineering and isolating when people have problems, but we don't need to do that until they actually doing the thing. It's like if somebody wants to squat, you just make them squat, and then based on the problems that they have in a squat, you'll give them as accessories. If that makes sense. Same for a handstand. Like make someone handstand based on the problem they have in a handstand, give them accessories, but you never stop handstanding. So alignment drills, I don't really give much of, because the chest to wall hold is a perfect alignment drill, and it's actually transferable to the handstand itself. Like if you can get someone to get into a chest to wall hold, and then you can cue them properly in a chest to wall hold, they will indirectly be doing the handstand alignment drill, but while in a handstand, if that makes sense. I'm not saying that alignment drills like back to wall, front body line drill and back body line drill, I'm not saying they have like zero use. The front body line drill I really like. The lifting the stick off the floor, I think that's a really nice drill. And I'll sometimes use it as a warm-up for people who are on the, the people who are kind of like a bag of noodles. They're just like a bag of soft noodles, a little bit floppy, a little
Yeah.
bit too soft. For those, I will sometimes use things like front body line drill and every now and again a hollow body hold, just so that they can fire up and they can just work these muscles and hold them in the places that we kind of need them to be, but it'll be a very small part of their training. The rest of it is just going to be on shoulders and
Yeah.
handstands.
Yeah, nice, man. Yeah, I agree with you there too. I think the alignment comes in the handstand. You've got to be training the handstand. That's the time where you've got to dedicate more time. I do like the front body, back body line drills, like you say, maybe just as like a teaching tool for tension. But obviously the tension you hold in a back body line drill is significantly higher than the tension that you hold in a handstand. Like gravity's working against you there, to hold a hollow body shape, whereas in the actual handstand itself, gravity's working in a different plane, or same plane, but we're in a different plane. But just like say the noodle people, the people that are the bag of sand is what I'd say. It's just okay. You need to have a little bit of tension in the muscle. It's not 100% contraction. You're contracting every muscle as hard as you can, but you need to have just that little bit of tension, that feedback, so you can control it. So yeah, definitely, I think it has its place, but maybe a lot of people overuse it.
Yeah.
Time and a place to do it. So yeah.
Well, yeah, the easiest way to like look at it is how much tension do we actually need in this? What we start to understand is if the base is weak, then it will express more like noodleness up the chain. So like let's say when a baby is trying to walk or a toddler's trying to learn to walk and they're standing up and you can see them, they're like wobbling about. It's like the glutes and their legs are still underdeveloped. Like now, like you can stand up and you can completely turn off your abs. Why do you not fall down? It's because your hips are strong and your glutes are strong and they're supporting you there. Whereas if you're in a handstand, it's the same thing, but it's just with the shoulders. If the shoulders are weak, you're going to be wobbling. I've had so many people in their training be like, "Oh, I can't stop my wobbles. So do I need to do more core work?" Like, well, no, it's not really, because the core isn't stop. It's not going to stop you from wobbling if your shoulders are weak. It's like how are you gonna balance on basically glass? You need some like cement. Your shoulders need to be stronger.
Yeah, exactly that, mate. Exactly that. Yeah, I think it's a good question. Do I get a six pack if I train handstands? Is it good for my core?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, you just need to do lots of press handstands.
Oh dear, mate. Let's finish up maybe just on a bit. We've covered a lot. I think there's a lot, and there's a lot for people to take away from this. But like,
Yeah.
where would you start with handstand training? Maybe we just touch on a little bit of like a couple of drills you might like to use. Maybe your favorite drills with handstand training. And like, what sort of frequencies and volumes are we looking at, and any sort of milestones? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So if you're someone who's never done this before, never done a handstand before, but you really want to, you like what you see and you kind of want to get involved, just basically have a little test. Can you walk up into a chest to wall handstand? So can you like walk your feet up the wall, bring your hands close-ish to the wall? Maybe at the beginning, don't go super close, be like bring your hands at max like 1 foot away from the wall. Can you do that? First time you do it, it's going to be a bit wobbly, but we just want to see if you can do that. And if you can, then I would start with like no more than 3 times a week and no more than like 3 sets of like chest to wall holds a week, along with some like wrist loading in some like wrist warm-ups and things like that. So think like the quadruped position. That's a really nice one. And then like just taking your weight forward, backwards, side to side, and just kind of getting those wrists prepped. So you kind of do that at the beginning, and then you would work on some chest to wall holds. And if you're really confident as a beginner, you can start working on what I call the mini half kick up. So this is when you put your hands on the floor, and you're just doing like a small kick up. You're not trying to get your hips all the way over your shoulders, but you just want to start getting used to jumping up a little bit and putting some power through the legs to bring your weight up and over your hands. Not massively so that you have a chance of falling over, but you just a little bit. But this will eventually grow to like a proper kick up where we're trying to get the hips over the shoulders. But first, we're just doing an introduction to it. It's called a mini half kick up. So this is the way that I would look at it. It's like kind of wrist conditioning and then shoulder conditioning, and then a bit of technique work, which is the kicking up. I wouldn't even try and balance just yet, depending on how your chest to wall is.
Yeah, nice one, man. Yeah, I like that. And then for the people that can hold that 30-second chest to wall handstand, what would be some of your next progressions off that?
Cool. So if you can hold your chest to wall handstand, now we're actually ready to start handstanding as a skill. We're still going to have a lot of conditioning to do because you'll still be relatively beginner. So you want to build that 30 seconds up to 60, but it's not going to be the focus anymore. Now the focus is going to be on, okay, how do I actually balance? What am I doing? So the way I like to create my programs, they look like this. At the beginning, you have your wrist warm up, always the wrist warm up at the beginning. And then you have your entries. So the entries are your kick ups or your half kick ups or your tuck ups or straddle ups, things like this. So it's the way that you would enter a handstand. This is purely usually technique focused. I would give them no more than like 15 to 20 minutes worth of entry practice. Even that's pushing it. Usually it's like 10 to 15 minutes where you're just practicing kick ups, making the kick up a bit more refined. You're not trying to balance, but you are trying to find a little bit of float when you get up there. And not enough to burn out. Make sure you're resting between the reps. Once you've done your wrists, you've done your entries, now it's time for balance. So this is now when we're trying to figure out which mechanisms do we need to work on to correct ourselves from falling over in space. Generally speaking, people will be doing this against the wall. So we have our heel pulls and toe pulls. We have a way to fix our balance in an underbalance if we're falling in an underbalance. And the way we fix that is with our toe pull drill. So this is when you're in a chest to wall handstand and you're purposefully trying to pull yourself off of the wall by taking your shoulders forward. And then we have overbalance. So this is a heel pull. So when you kick up against the wall, your heels are on the wall. Now you're pressing the fingers into the floor and you're pulling yourself off the wall. So these are the two balance avenues that you need to teach, or I teach beginners or anyone really, even the less beginner people, I'll still be teaching heel pulls and toe pulls. Usually the heel pulls I will take out of the program first and they'll stay on toe pulls for longer. Generally, what I find is that when people are training kick-ups, they're kind of training the heel pull action as well. And then
When
the
you
end
say
of
you
the
take the heel pull out, is there a
yeah.
milestone that you're
Oh
aiming
yeah.
to see before you take the heel pull out?
Yeah, sorry, that's a good question. You want to be able to pull off the wall and hold at least for like 5 seconds. And then you can like relax the fingers, go back to the wall. And then again, you pull off the wall, hold for 5 seconds, relax fingers, go back to the wall. This is, if they can do this for like 3-4 reps, I'm pretty happy that they can move on from their heel pulls and they don't really need that in their programming anymore. I'd much rather them just spend more time chest to wall and balancing off the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've covered wrists, covered entries, covered balance drills, so heel pulls, toe pulls. And then the last one is strength. And this is where I would make them continue their chest to wall holds and build out to 60 seconds.
Yeah, nice, man. No, it's a good lot of progressions. They're basic drills, but they're the drills that are best bang for your buck. It's time in the handstand, it's time conditioning the wrist, it's time on the shoulders, it's time with alignment. Like it ticks all the boxes that we need to do, and it's not overcomplicating it. It's not the 3 best drills for handstands. It's just like here are the basics, and let's stick to the basics.
It's like when you have like a strength training program. Let's say you're doing, I don't know, let's say you're doing like an upper body, like pull and push, whatever. You have like generally you do your vertical heavy sets and reps first, and then you'll do maybe some lighter reps for less sets after, and then at the end you'll do some accessories that's responsible for the vertical pulling muscles, maybe like biceps, overhead tricep extensions and something for rotator cuffs. But usually speaking, like a proper strength and conditioning coach will have a template-ish that they will run with for everyone. It's the same for handstands. So that template that I just gave there, we have wrists, entries, balance, strength in that order. I will kind of keep going forward all the way to a press the handstand. To be honest, I have people doing press the handstand sessions, and it's the exact same template as that. It's just different progressions, but same template. So it'll be wrists, entries, balance drills, but the balance will be a lot less in a press session, and then they'll be doing the strength work, which is the press work.
Yeah, awesome, man. I like it.
Yeah.
Well, that's That's a lot we've talked about, mate. I think there's a lot to take away there for everybody. Is there anything else you want to add before we sort of finish this up?
Yeah, the milestones I think was a good one. I didn't really talk too much. We spoke about the milestones for the hill pulls and stuff. I think for milestones, like get yourself to a 30-second chest to wall handstand where you're not shaking and you don't feel like you're gonna, fall over and die. And then start working on the balance drills where you're working on heel pulls and toe pulls, and you want to get them to the point where you can float off the wall and hold a little bit of balance. Once you can do that, that's when you want to actually start trying to balance on the floor. Don't try and balance on the floor until you can actually balance off the wall.
Yeah, that's it. That freestanding one. People rush that freestanding in the middle of the room. And like you say, I agree with you there. You've got to be able to show control of overbalance and control of underbalance through the toe pull and heel pull off the wall before you'd even start worrying about, moving to the middle of the room. I like the fact that you start to introduce kick-ups early. I think that half kick-up is a great drill because kick-ups are just a skill and they take a lot of time to learn. And I think that's the big fear though, too. So like you're attacking the fear side of it a little bit by just playing, with half kick ups and building, that awareness in there too, because once you get that, passing the heel pull and toe pull drill, it's like, okay, now you got to kick up. And if you've never kicked up before, well, then that's another journey in itself, learning to
exactly.
kick up.
Yeah. So I always keep the kick ups in there from the beginner stage up until advanced. It just doesn't have a huge focus at the beginning. It's like you're just trying to refine technique. And then, then you can start trying to balance on the floor once you've got the control of the underbalance to overbalance. And then generally speaking, once you can hit about 30 seconds on a freestanding handstand, or even a little bit before that is fine, you can start working on some shapes like tuck handstands, straddle handstands, etc. Normally, I would have people playing with some shapes training shapes on the wall while they're building their freestanding straight on the floor.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I'm the same. I think there's a lot we can take out of that, add some variety, but also like you sort of said before, that, to build strength in that shoulder flexion position as we start to bring down more weight on the underbalance side, we have to really learn how to strengthen those shoulders. So, the tuck on the wall facing tuck and all that sort of stuff is beneficial. No, it's awesome, mate. Mate, it's been a pleasure to chat to you and hear about, what you do with your clients in terms of their handstand journey and everything. If people want to reach out, ask you questions, all that sort of stuff, where can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram at learningtohuman, LEARNINGTO human. That's probably the best place to find me. Or you can type Learn to Human on YouTube. I think I've got my YouTube account comes up now when you do that as well.
Nice. You go, mate. It's all happening.
I know, right? So much, all these channels and websites and
Mate, you've got a workshop coming up and you've got a retreat coming up. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, awesome. So I have a workshop coming up in London, actually. So when I get back to London, I plan to teach in Hackney, small workshop on how to integrate handstands, bodyweight strength, and flexibility. Basically everything we speak about in this podcast, how to integrate them into a practice and develop your own practice with the underlying blueprints. So not just like throwing drills at people, but more so like teaching them what's important so they can kind of take that home and go and work on that.
Yep. What are the dates of that?
That's in August. And if
put you under the pump now, come on.
Mate, you are. I think it's August 5th and 6th. It's the 5th and 6th of August.
Yeah.
And then my retreat is in the Azores, September the 9th until the 16th. There's only 2 spots left on that one. So that's filling up pretty fast. And that's a week of intensive training, but also a bit more along the lines of what I feel are my values of learning to human and kind of introducing people to the food side of things, how I like to eat, the stress management side of things, the adventure side of things. We do some adventures. We go and explore the island, go snorkeling, get stung by jellyfish, stuff like that.
It's the full experience, mate. I love it. Immersed in the learning to human world.
Yeah, a whole week of that in the Azores. I'm looking forward to that. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, awesome, mate. What were the dates of that one again?
That was September 9th to the 16th.
Yeah, wicked, mate. No, it looked like last time you ran that, it was a great week. And, lots of people took a lot away from that. The photos and stuff that you put up with that were pretty cool, mate. And I think your Instagram, you've got a few videos of you teaching there as well. So if people are interested in that, just check out Learning to Human on Instagram and go back in time and check out some of what Eddie's done. But yeah, it'd be a good experience to be over there and doing that too. So yeah, awesome.
And
I'm at stretch.rainer on Instagram, or the Sustainable Training Method. tstmethod.com is the website. So if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out there. Also want to say, if there's certain topics that you'd like Ernie and I to speak about on the podcast, feel free to hit us up, drop us a DM, let us know what you're struggling with, what you'd like to learn more about, and who knows, we might even talk about that specific topic. But we'll see how we go. Awesome. Anything else you want to say, mate, before we finish up?
No, all good. Yeah, it'll be good to hear from some of the listeners. Yeah, if you guys made it this far into the podcast, well done. But yeah, shoot us a message and say hi.
Of course they will, mate. We're entertaining. Come on.
Yeah.
All right, mate. Great to chat. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next month.